Now the next speaker has been introduced so many times, all I need to say is Peter Landin.
It depends on which notation side you have. If you have a box, then
Testing this microphone. I have no slides. I think some of you might not realise what a fantastically privileged audience you all are, because I have learnt so much from these three preceding things. I'm one of those people that has never really understood anything unless I think I invented it myself. And it's an extremely limiting view to do science. But I think today I've actually understood a number of things that have gone on since 1970, where more or less I ceased to be interested in the theory of computing. And I've understood things that I've always assumed were going to be much too complicated for me to ever understand or begin to understand. So I've been quite, I'm now energized into trying to understand a few things. When I was very kindly invited to come here, and it was by a very old colleague of mine, so I thought I was getting here, so to speak, out of, what's it called, cronyism, namely George Davis, whom I first met over some old computer, which I think is downstairs now, complete with its telephone dial. Is that right?
It's less complete than it was, I'm sorry.
And I had been, as I was wondering what to say here, I was realising that people have mixed biography and technical history, and so I'll mix biography and technical history, except that my technical history stops about 1970. So back in 1954 or something or other, having been thoroughly disparaging concerning computers because I'd watched something called an EDSAC stumbling through a Ramakuta and decided this was not for me. But then I myself stumbled into a job with trying to make holorith accounting machines do computing. And indeed, I spent a very engaging 3 months making holorith computer machines do a statistical analysis of the thermal conductivity of North Sea herrings for some government office. And this made me decide that maybe computing might be interesting after all, and because of a fortunate link which led me to George Davis here, I ended up at the National Physical Laboratory where he was with this early machine that's downstairs in pieces apparently, or depleted, where I because I had a friend who didn't believe in the laws of probability and believed that parapsychology was an ordinary thing rather than a pathological thing, I immediately set about testing whether the pilot ace had parapsychological powers. And I didn't. It didn't.
So far as you know.
It just produced a lot of binomial distributions on those cards with little corner cut off, which made lovely wallpaper. Anyway, not very long after then, I came, although he probably didn't realise it, under the influence of John McCarthy. And indeed, I think all that work that I was doing that time was so much merely was me thinking that what I was doing was to tidy up a few loose ends of McCarthy. And probably not even realising that the loose ends that it is that I was tidying up were what he considered to be the less important part of his contribution to the subject. I'm not sure about that, but of course this led to, after, I think Lisp was around in 1958 at an NPL conference, and I was extremely excited to learn about garbage collection, because I'd been trying to think at the time how to do, I knew about lambda calculus because when I was an undergraduate, there was this, I was rather foolishly put into a fast lane, acquiring a degree in 2 years rather than 3. And consequently, my first year was being taught analysis, this is in a mathematics degree, by an enthusiast for, in fact, I think he'd been a pupil of Alonzo Church, a very formidable man called Norman Steen, who taught me analysis. And during the time that this was going on, the parallel stream got bigger and bigger, and the lambda calculus version of it got smaller in terms of audiences. And at some point or other, I and a friend of mine, we were roommating together, realised that we were the only two people who were going to follow this particular stream, and we better make sure that at least one of us was present at each lecture. And I know there was one occasion when we realised we'd missed both of them, that both of us missed them, and we thought, I think probably we were correct in supposing, because of the inflexible social manner of Norman Steen, that he delivered his lecture anyway. And we didn't understand the notes to know whether there was a gap. So this connection with Untitled essentially came from there. And I was determined to waste the time of the English Electric Company by trying to make the Pilot Ace, or its immediate successor, do beta reduction. And it was very, very difficult with these delay lines and these drums and things. You're allowed to interrupt. So anyway, then I encountered McCarthy and his beginnings of Lisp, which were amazingly modest in their reliance on. He had the word lambda, but I don't think he knew what he was into at the time. It was sort of a Fortran-like language about lists with the word lambda in it. But anyway, of course, in what ensued from that very rapidly, it became this language which it was possible for somebody to design an abstract machine for. Famous Alan Gilmore's abstract Lisp machine, which was really an inspiration to me, because that was exactly a sort of extremely messy thing that I realised a way of tidying up. But at the time I was only tidying up, hence the SCCD machine. I was tidying up this Gilmore machine and trying to put some kind of, crucially, put some symmetry between treatments of functions and treatments of arguments, which were at the time totally, I think, sort of very, very. It was very ill understood that a function could be a data item, I think, at the time. So that's then how my lambda stuff arose, and by this time I had been assisting Christopher Strachey in debugging some of his programs by the famous method that on our Pilot Ace-like machine. And thus, I joined him as his sole employee ever, as a computer consultant, and had a delightful 4 years working in a back studio somewhere off Kensington Church Street, where there were 3 gram canners and 2 cats. And during that time, I was failing to produce a compiler for one of his industrial clients. I think I was supposed to be simulating. I was supposed to be equipping a new Ferrante computer with a Mercury autocode compatible compiler. That was it. So I decided the only way to do it was with lambda calculus, of course, because that's about all I knew about. And this then led to all that stuff that came out in the Vienna conference, which Tony Hoare mentioned to you. In fact, I don't know whether Tony Hoare remembers, but there were about 12 papers giving a variety of sometimes sensible and some silly. I'll let other people choose who look at that book, which is beautifully documented with what do you call it? An account of the a verbatim account of the discussions that went on after each talk, as I'm sure will be this thing. In one of the verbatim accounts, I don't know, right at the end, yes, absurdly, whoever was organising it said, well, let's decide which is the best method of doing the semantics of programming languages. Let's have a vote. Now, I don't know which way Tony Hoare voted, but I won the vote. So, by this time, I was on my way to MIT, courtesy of that other great person that I was parasitical on, apart from John McCarthy, and that was Christopher Strachey. Because he had spent a year there, and I'm getting confused about the time order. Wait a minute now. We got as far as 1963-4, that's right. And he'd spent a year at MIT under the patronage of a man who had a code. Robert Farno had a code, Farno Codes, information theorist. And they were trying to set up a teaching department in computing. It was, at the time there was something called Project Mac. And Farno, who was an extremely energetic man and talked explosively and rapidly about everything with a strong Italian accent, was absolutely indignant that he'd been required to teach a course in Fortran. Well, he said, I've got to teach this course if I know what it's about. And then he said, they started telling me what the stuff was. And it was all gobbledygook. It was nonsense, he said. And I was, by that time, producing stuff about some kind of logical notion, really applying tasky type semantic stuff about the relationship between names and meanings to programming languages. And this then led to me spending a year there, out of which came this PAL thing that has been mentioned. And during that time, I can remember MIT was in the Department of Electrical Engineering, as it essentially was in great turmoil of conflicting views about how to introduce computing into a graduate and then an undergraduate course. And the various people had become very heated about it. Minskey, I can remember, that man who, I can't remember, I've forgotten the names now, name them. The senior moments sometimes. And Minskey was extremely hostile to this non-calculus stuff. I think on the very reasonable ground that he'd seen all these people getting grants for doing research in what were called algol-like languages, actually studying language theory in the mathematical and automata-related sense. And he knew there was a big con going on about money being gained by sticking the word computer onto something. I think he assumed that those of us who were talking about anti-calculus were similarly suspect. And so he imported an old mucker of his called Dana Scott to come along and defeat me. And so this would have been 66, I suppose. Because meantime I had moved from an industrial job oh, that's right, that's the chronological gap that I'd lost. I moved from an industrial job in America to a university job in America during about 3 years, the middle of the 60s. So Scott came along, and I won the argument, crucially on confluence, because I said, look, you've got to be able to have, to be able to state the equivalence between an interior chunk of a program and another chunk that would do as well in that context. There's a word for that these days, I can't remember what it is. And he said, you don't need to do that, because after all, programs are just things you run, you see. And so we had this argument. He didn't know much about programming, but he was one of a staggering example of a person who, following up what Robert Milner was saying, was able very, very rapidly to get a practical grasp of programming alongside his already developing his great theoretical energy in the subject. I think that was very impressive. And that was what was going on during that time, leading to this famous lectures at Oxford that have been mentioned already. And subsequent to them, I can remember I was in New York and at this famous talk by, who's the man who did the assertions at the beginning? Floyd, that's right. I went along to a talk Floyd was giving in New York, and indeed Scott was there. I realised at the time that I don't think I understood Floyd's assertions, because I think I kept on oscillating between, are these things that are a proof aid, or are they things that are implemented when you run the program? And I take it that they were the former and not the latter, but I might be wrong. Scott was there, and indeed by that time, this was a year after the famous Oxford lectures, which hinged on the question of type structures versus non-type structures. I remember going off to Princeton for a few days with Scott then, and being in in this rather daunting situation of being the audience of one of his of him teaching me his latest system about neighbourhoods. So during all that time, of course, this among other things was followed by Scott going to must have been this other meeting with Strachey, because by that time I think I'd lost contact with Strachey. I'm now talking about six. No, I haven't. No. Anyway, I'm not going to talk technical because, as I say, I think that you've had loads of technical stuff and it's hot and it's coming on to tea, and I'm going to stop sooner than my advertised time. It's funny actually. The other day I was thinking about program verification, to which I did contribute a paper. Actually, that was one of the last papers I actually published. It was in 1967 or 8 or something or other, and a colleague of mine, who I think is a tragedy, is not here, namely Rob Burstall, but he's got much more interesting things to do these days. And he and I...
Buddhism in France.
Buddhism, that's right, yes. And we were very attracted by this McCarthy stuff about recursion induction on proving a rather simple compiler correct. And so, but then we thought, hey, commutative diagrams, and we sort of did a commutative diagram thing about it. I was looking at it today. I looked up a copy of it, and it's pages and pages. It depends on having a whole series of machines simulating one another and proving that they do. And I'm sure it could all be done with categories these days in half a page, but I don't know. So what I was thinking of the other day was that until about a couple of years ago, people who use the ATMs of a bank that I use used to find that there was a tremendous uniformity about them, and it was all very straightforward. And then there started to be filtered in, site by site, some revision of the machinery for this, which among other things allowed for lots of pretty pictures and I take it advertisements. But unfortunately, lacked two valuable features. One, that when you put in your login 4-digit thing, it lacked the fact that it made a noise, which was very confusing. And number two, that it lacks the fourth asterisk that it displayed on the screen. So at the ATM near to where I live, queues built up because people tried 5 and 6 times, assuming they'd made a mistake. By now everyone's used to this particular feature of this particular bank's ATMs, I think. I then, over the last several years, I've had some correspondence with them about it, and it's very clear, of course, that it's a very simple programming error, namely coming out of the loop at the wrong time, and the fourth asterisk does appear, but disappears just before it appears, or something like that. I wrote them that. Eventually got them to concede that, yes, this is the case, and they say they will correct it. They said to me this 6 months ago, they will correct it in their 2002 update. And of course, I think there's something interesting here, apropos of what the stuff of this seminar is about. Namely, that what we are talking about is the stuff that will become the material of those people who, I've forgotten the word, the regulators of software will be depending heavily on the concepts that you have heard described and that will continue to be described. And because, of course, we now realise, if we consider the way that regulation has had its effect in numerous industries, most recently agriculture, we realise that there are many other contributing factors to the work of regulation than the technical things that are provided for them by the scientists. On the other hand, of course, it is essential to their work that these scientists are providing some legitimacy for this. And I think that we have to be aware that maybe already there are little bits of regulators doing this, and maybe some of my colleagues here already work on these government committees that do it, but I don't. But the stuff that we are now, that is being talked about today, the topics, are going to be certainly the topics that will be as the scientific journalists in these controversial issues say, of course, were too difficult to actually present to the politicians, let alone the public, but nevertheless played an essential part. And of course, the dialectic that then goes on is that there's always room to renew the debate by saying, oh, well, we didn't bother mentioning vaccines to you because we thought you wouldn't understand them. But now you've mentioned it, yes, it is true that we could have done so with vaccines or something or other. I predicted in 3 weeks' time we will learn that Britain, although it persuaded Western Europe to abandon vaccination, I'm talking about these cow things, in 1991, it will turn out that totally consistently with all these other assertions, Britain has been vaccinating for the last 10 years. I'm going to stop.
Questions for Peter? I have one that connects very much with Rob, who would have loved to have been here, but is away on meditation practice in his house in France. And I remember this algebra paper that you wrote, 2 planes of algebras with...
Oh, that was quite a different thing. That was another topic entirely.
That was a later one, was it?
Yeah, this one was called, hang on, it was called Programs and Their Proofs, an Algebraic Approach.
Oh, I remember that one as well. Yeah, the real question was, what led you to you and Rod to the algebraic work?
Oh, because as well as being taught lambda calculus as an undergraduate, I was taught universal algebra. And I was probably just in an incredibly lucky situation at that time, in around about 1960 or something or other, of being one of the few people who were engaged in computing who knew about lambda calculus and universal algebra.
And going back to Robin Bloomfield's question about communities, can you add any details to this bookshop story of Mervin's bringing people together?
Sorry, I'm just looking at what the timetable says.
That's okay, you've got a couple of minutes.
Well, I can remember when I ceased to be an undergraduate, and because of having been fast-laned through all these things and leaving with a rather ambiguously low-grade degree, I was very uncertain what to do with my life, and spent next 6 months in Sheffield Reference Library trying to avoid making a decision about my life. I used to go out to a cafe, a housewife's cafe, just around the corner from the Sheffield Reference Library, in the centre of this town, Sheffield, where I was born and grew up. And one day I was having my coffee in Fields Cafe, and a voice came booming across the housewife's tables. I say this because that's exactly what it was in those days. And this voice said, "I say, didn't I see you reading Principia Mathematica in the reference library this morning?" And thus I got to know the legendary Marvin, who immediately tried to recruit me to his reading group, which at that time was halfway through the 12 volumes of Gibbon's Decline and Fall. And then I left the town and not to avoid him, and ran into him in a London street shortly after I'd come to live in London. And he said, "Oh, I've got a reading group now, and we are reading," and it turned out to be, it was Markov's vast book on algorithms. That's right. Yes. The texture of this, the structure of these meetings of Mervin was very sort of theological in style, I suppose. You would read in clockwise order aloud pages, miming the formulas to the best of your ability. And thus many such books were read.
Who was in the group at the point you joined, and who else joined?
Well, during that time, I suppose that quite a number of the people, I don't know, I can't remember whether Robin Milner.
I came once or twice.
I don't blame you. Certainly that's how Rod and I met each other. The method of recruiting was actually at Dillon's, not and I know that at one time Marvin had encountered a person there, an elderly and rather apoplectic gentleman, who said, and he said, "Oh, are you looking at the books on logic?" And this man said yes, and he said, "Oh, would you like to join my study group?" and I have a friend called Peter Landin who's joining, and then this bloke turned out to be Lord Halsbury, who is doing the kind of joint venture schemes on the financing of British computing at the time. And he declined the invitation to join. The other people involved, there was a man who was quite very much a sort of, what is it called, machine architecture person, John Ives. And of course there was George Colores, who took up it was actually, the CPL, someone should have said it actually stood for Christopher's programming language. I think that was it, wasn't it? As well as all the other things it stood for. Indeed.
I wrote an article about Christopher last year in which I said some people thought of it as Christopher's programming language, and I was allowed to get away with that, but one of the editors was very insistent that no one should say it actually was called Christopher's programming language.
Well, I think it was both the name was as much a moving target as the language.
John Reynolds?
Could you say a bit about Penrose's involvement?
Well, yes, it's slightly at odds with something that I read afterwards in a longish biographical essay concerning Christopher Strachey that appeared in this. Is it called General History of Computing, something like that? Because my memories, although it might be my personal hubris, was that rather similarly to Dana Scott being called in to kill me, by Minskey, that Roger Penrose had been called in to kill me by Strachey, and again, once again, I survived these terrible ordeals, as my memory was. But if it was true that that Penrose, because they were muckers from years back, that Penrose had told Strachey about undercalculus, I think he'd forgotten by the time he met me, but I don't know. This looks like a tale like that. Question.
Richard Bourne at Queen Mary College. You've said that we'll be tools of regulators in the future, and I fear you're going to be right. But is it the science we do, or is it that we do science? I mean, should we be doing something else?
Oh, I don't think so, no. Well, it could be, I think the question is who should we be doing. You see, at the moment, the only thing that counts as science is something that has a job number, a proposal number, a grant number. And more or less, I think, what you might be doing and innovating wouldn't count as science if it was not done like that. I mean, it's staggering that this paper of mine that very kindly allowed me to sort of live on a state pension for 15 years or something in mechanical evaluation of expressions, because I was in a rather similar situation to what somebody mentioned earlier today, that I benefited immensely from the fact that no one seemed to value what I was doing for about 15 years, so I could go on living on it. In fact, when accreditation indices were being invented, and I started having to give in this new managerialized university life that hit us sometime in the 80s, and I was very distressed because, of course, I didn't have any job numbers and grant numbers and proposal numbers and things, and also I didn't think that my citation index wouldn't stand up to much. So I invented a few names for the things that I was studying, and one was the lagged citation index. I scored really highly. What I mean is, if there were, I do know a few of my colleagues who have, so to speak, dropped out of both industrial and or academic computing and believe that they have lent their services to what you might think intermediate technology, stuff like that or something or other. But I should imagine it's at a pretty low level from our point of view. Although I know people who've, in similarly not in computing but in engineering, got an immense amount of satisfaction by successfully launching funny kinds of laboratories for the third world and things like that.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Peter. It remains to me to say a few summary words and to thank people, and I'll try and be very brief. This event came about when Chris Burton emailed me and said, would I like to give a talk on a history paper which I'd written some while ago on program verification. Copies of that paper are over there. The only reason for the publicity is I'm not carrying them back with me afterwards. But I said to Chris and to George, I thought I could do rather better than that and get together a group of people who would be more interesting. Fortunately, I met Jonathan at another CCS event, and Jonathan has done really all of the organisation, and I've done very little. I've greatly enjoyed this afternoon, and my first big vote of thanks is to the speakers, who have been absolutely fascinating. Although I've known a lot of this material, I've learned something from all of them, and from the questioners this afternoon. Peter Mosses, who sent his greetings to all his friends and said he was sorry he couldn't be here, said, since this was subtitled The Early Work, are we going to have a subsequent event on the later work, or as Jonathan corrected, let's not be too adventurous, the mid-work next? And I personally feel, I don't know about the Computer Conservation Society, this event's been a huge success, and the number of people here is some testament to that, and that we should go on and try and do more in the software area, and maybe specifically in the formal area, although with a decent gap perhaps. There are many, many things which have been just touched on or referred to and could be expanded. David Park's work, I think, deserves much more discussion, and going right back to the beginning, the work that he was involved in with Patterson, Luckham and Park, the work on equivalencies, which again comes up in some of Tony's more recent work. Robin Milner's rejected paper